Welcome to the video research workshop, Creating a Presidential Co-op. I'm Andrea Langrish, Managing Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement. This is the first workshop in a three-part series hosted by the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement and Advanced Methods at Purdue. Today's workshop describes the ideas and research behind the formation and use of a C-SPAN presidential debate co-op and the analysis opportunities that data co-ops make possible. I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Robert Browning to introduce our presenters.
Hi, I'm Robert Browning, Faculty Director of the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement, and I'm delighted to have you all here today and to welcome our guests, Dhavan Shah and Erik Bucy. Dhavan is the Lewis A. Mary and Mary E. Mayer Bascom Professor at the University of Wisconsin, where he's the Director of the Mass Communication Research Center and the Scientific Director of the Center for Health Enhancement System Studies. His research focuses on the influence of conventional and digital media on social judgments, civic engagement, and health support. Erik is the Marshall and Charlene Formby Regents Professor of Strategic Communication at the College of Media and Communications at Texas Tech University. He teaches and conducts research on disinformation, visual communication, political nonverbal behavior, and public opinion in the press. Welcome, Dhavan and Erik. I turn it over to you.
Great, and thanks for that introduction, Robert. Really appreciate the invitation and opportunity to talk about this idea and to talk about our research. And I think the C-SPAN Archives and the Center for Scholarship and Engagement is doing some really interesting work. If people either watching this or logged in right now don't realize, there's an annual conference every year that the C-SPAN Center sponsors, and it's competitive, but if you are accepted into the conference, you're funded with a small grant to do the research. So it's a terrific opportunity, both for faculty and graduate students, to really utilize the C-SPAN resources as we have, and then to develop a research program out of it. It's a really broad and kind of deep resource. So let's get right to the research. Dhavan and I are gonna go back and forth a little bit depending on the topic and the emphasis. So I'm gonna open, then Dhavan's gonna take it, and then it'll go back to me, et cetera. And I wanna jump right into the approach and really start to kind of look at the background factors of how we got to analyzing presidential debates and eventually incorporating Twitter data and looking at it computationally. It starts for me with an emphasis on the image in political life and really focusing on, instead of the spoken word, starting to look at nonverbal behavior and visual communication within political communication. And it kind of comes together in a book I co-wrote with Betsy Grabe on Image by Politics. And here we're looking at the visual features and the nonverbal behavior and the candidate performance aspects of politics, really more than the verbal aspects. It's not that I ignore the verbal aspects or think they're unimportant. It's just that we haven't paid enough attention to the visual. So what do visuals impart? Well, they impart a kind of social information. We read people's body language, we look at their expressions, we infer emotion, we assess traits. And in politics, we look at candidates in terms of competence and electability. There's a lot that goes on very quickly. And in doing this work, I really like to embrace, and so does Dhavan, a multi-methodological perspective. So it's not just one tool fits all. It's really the question and the theories and the concepts you're interested in should drive the analytical kind of leverage that you use. So whether it's content analysis, might be surveys, experiments, social media analysis, computational techniques, even eye tracking and some other things related to experimental work. So it's a multi-pronged, multi kind of faceted research program. Just some basics on nonverbals. Why pay attention to nonverbals in politics? Well, leadership, it turns out, has a really large nonverbal component. As I mentioned, you can infer character traits pretty reliably, pretty quickly, meaning within fractions of a second, to kind of attribute candidate competence, leadership potential, things like strengths, things like honesty, And that another aspect of nonverbal behavior that's interesting is that dominant individuals have an attention binding quality. And this is observed in human society. It's observed in animal society. The leader is literally the most watched person. So if you want to know the leader of any social group, look at who everybody else is looking at. What else about nonverbals? Well, they affect viewer attitudes, and they also serve as motivational cues. And that is, particularly in a moment of crisis or moment of uncertainty, who do you look to for direction? Who do you look to for guidance? Who does the media system look to for a comment or for a policy statement or a reaction? It's usually the leader. It's usually the president. In an organization, it's usually the head of the organization or somebody empowered to make a decision. So it ends up being very important how behavioral cues are communicated, particularly in times of crisis or urgency. The other reason to study nonverbals and visuals in particular is that we're really set up cognitively to process visuals very efficiently. And for that reason, they've sometimes been overlooked in research because they're kind of taken for granted. We have this large visual cortex in the brain that allows us to kind of quickly assess visuals, so much so that they don't even seem they're worth our time studying. In fact, they are, and as the research we're going to talk about shows, they're really important in driving all kinds of response in terms of the audience. So visual experience then is a different form of learning and evaluation. Social information is readily encoded from what we see and easily retrieved in memory. Here's a situation I set up in an experiment where I kind of showed people first a crisis situation, which was the 9/11 attacks. And I varied them by their level of intensity. They're high on the upper left or lower on the upper right. And then I altered the nonverbal behavior, the images that I showed of George Bush. One was a little less confident, a little less certain. I called it a low potency display. And one was a higher potency, more confident, more assertive display. The level of anxiety was lowered or mitigated by the sequence on the right. And it was actually aggravated by the sequence on the left. So even after the fact, you're watching this and you know it happened, your level of anxiety can be modulated by how the leader responds. So it's really interesting converging data that you find when you look at visuals. So, I would use this slide in previous talks to talk about the difference between scientific information and what we call social information. But I'm sure everybody's eye has already gone to Mike Pence's head and say, is that a fly sitting on his head? And that tiny little speck is probably dominating the entire slide. And so, this kind of shows the importance and the attentiveness and the precision with which we pick up on things that are visual and how efficient we are. So another experiment I ran was I altered the looks of Kamala Harris in the split screen in reaction to the fly. So we have Pence with no fly. We have Harris, looking neutral. We have Pence with a fly, Harris looking disgusted, Pence with two flies, Harris looking surprised and shocked. We added the second fly. But whether you manipulate images or not, and for the most part, we don't when analyzing them, and that's only for experimental treatments, you have to realize what they convey. And one of the things that's important to realize is that visuals, unlike verbal information and learning from books or learning from speeches or learning from other kind of textual forms, visuals require minimal literacy in the classical sense, and they enable these quick inferences. So everybody can do it. So in a sense, they're equalizing, they're democratizing. And a couple very interesting studies have been done, one by Marcus Pryor, another one by Betsy Grabe and colleagues, on visual political competence. And the minute you put an image in, along with a verbal question, suddenly people can perform better. They get more answers right. They end up knowing more about politics than we give them credit for. And so in a way, visuals are there to help actually equalize knowledge gaps. We don't recognize people as having this kind of information because we usually don't measure it. So increasingly, we need to consider the visuals in the work that we do in communication, political science, and computational work. and social science generally. So now let's talk a little bit more about facial expressions in particular, because the face is the most communicative part of the body, the most expressive. The musculature is very nuanced and kind of variable. And so there's a lot that happens in the face. And the face communicates both the emotion of the communicator as well as the motivational intent behind the display. And so some classic emotion/intention combinations I look at are anger and threat, happiness, reassurance, fear and evasion. There's a fourth one that's less common in politics called sadness appeasement. Now, I didn't invent these categories. They were distilled by a group of researchers at Dartmouth, actually, in the 1980s, involving an interdisciplinary team of political psychologists and psychologists and experimental psychologists. So they're derived from nonverbal behavior generally, but they particularly apply to leadership. Now, a thing about happiness displays and reassurance is that it doesn't just signal, oh, he's friendly or, oh, he's likable. In a behavioral sense, it actually discourages aggression or flight responses in somebody else. It's not something that you have to fear. It's not something you have to become angry at. And what it does, a well-performed smile and reassurance display, is it promotes bonding. Now, here's an interesting thing, and that can work for both supporters and opponents. Now, the threat display, which we've seen a lot recently with figures like Donald Trump, actually strengthens dominance attributions. It operates differently than reassurance in that the goal is not to discourage a fight response. It's not to discourage aggression. It's actually to bring it on. And what it does is it also promotes bonding, but mostly among followers. So you can see Trump throughout his 4 years in office and his campaigns constantly using the threat display. And it was working among followers. It was not working among people who are neutral or critical. So here's the threat display in action. This was from a dial test study we did at Texas Tech during the 2016 election. And you can see Trump's supporters, Republicans here, in response to his display against the statement that Clinton had made. You have Democrats in the yellow line, and you have Trump supporters really starting to go, vertical in their dial tests. The high point on the scale is 100. And when he would aggress, his supporters liked it. And so we saw evidence of this kind of rally effect for aggression towards the opponent. So when, there's theory that nonverbal behavior works, you can test it empirically and you can demonstrate it. And it really does work. And Trump's displays were much more effective at moving the needle upward than Clinton's were. Clinton relied more on arguments, on sound kind of reasoning. Even Democrats weren't that thrilled by it. Her highest score in this dial test was about 70. Trump's went to the limit at 100, which was the only time we saw it in a couple different elections. So here, just quickly, I'm going to save this for later. If you want to reference it, you can go back and look at it. There's some really good work done in the 1980s on what exactly constitutes a display, whether it's anger, threat, fear, evasion, or happiness, reassurance. It's a combination of what the eyes are doing, the eye orientation. Are you looking straight ahead? Is it a fixed stare? Or is it soft? And then you break away. Is it looking down? Your mouth corners, are they raised? Are they lowered? Is it a frown? Is it a smile? Are your teeth showing? If your upper teeth are showing, it's usually a smile. If your lower teeth are showing, it's usually a frown. Is your head vertical? Is it confident? Is it down? And does it move? So these are kind of the criteria we use when we classify displays. So, and it comes out of the animal behavior literature, but it applies to people. And there's there's even finer grain coding than this, the facial activation coding system at the muscle level. But I like to do it at the display level. And so here you can see Obama, kind of a classic happiness reassurance display. There's the upper teeth. In the lower right-hand corner, there's the lower teeth. It's an anger threat display. His eyes are fixed. He's on a target, happens to be Mitt Romney. There's a neutral expression in the top right. And an evasive expression, it's not exactly fear, but he wants out of the frame. He wants away from the question. It's looking down. Okay, and then you can see Romney's repertoire displays. And each candidate, each politician, political figure, individual is going to have a slightly different repertoire of displays, but there's going to be these commonalities. Again, what is the eye doing? What's the head, the motion of the head, the position of the head, what kind of teeth are showing, the softness of the eyes, other indicators. So it's very systematic, and you can get intercoder reliability by using the categories and not just looking at it impressionistically. Okay, so some of the concepts that we used, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it's not just that we code and say, oh, one person smiled more, one person frowned more, one person was a little more aggressive, and one person was a little more conciliatory. We actually use different literatures, and ranging from contentious politics, which has acknowledged the aggression that's been building in American politics, but really kind of world politics if you look at populism over time. Other concepts have to do with appropriateness of the display, which is its compatibility with the rhetorical setting in which it occurs. Expectancy violations, which could be both verbal, but I particularly am interested in nonverbal expectancy violation. Trump was a master at this, and the camera loved him for it, and the ratings did as well. And then also just kind of basic social dominance. I mean, what's really going on during a debate, you're trying to score points, even if it's rhetorical, you're trying to establish dominance. And if it's nonverbal, then it's kind of a much more direct form of dominance. Okay, so we take these categories and then we code them by segments. And in 2012, we divided the segments into 30-second segments, which was based on past debate research. In 2016 and 2020, we're now looking at 10-second segments. And this is hand coding. When we get to machine coding and kind of classifier recognition of displays, it happens at a much finer, precise level. But this is at 30 seconds to start with. So what do we see in terms of the difference between Romney and Obama's display? And in debate one, there was a big problem for Obama, which was he kept looking down. So this bar here, which is the number of times he was performing this behavior in the segments that we coded, was really high. He was looking down or away or evasive in some way more than twice as much as Romney was. And people noticed this. There was a big uproar among Democrats on Twitter, which kind of caught our attention. And at the same time, Obama was much less threatening in his use of facial display. So he's looking down and he's not looking assertive, essentially. At the same time, Romney's use of defiance gestures in an angry, threatening tone and a threatening face was much more pronounced. A lot of people thought Obama lost that debate, not on the basis of what he said, on the basis of how he performed. So then we go to the second one. We'll see if Obama learns. So let's look at fear evasion again and the defiance gestures. So we go to actually the third, we go to the third debate because it's comparable. The second debate was a town hall format, and it's really hard. It's kind of an apples and oranges comparison. When people are behind a podium or sitting at a desk, you can really code things fairly. So all of a sudden, the evasion goes away. It goes away in Obama and Romney. It's just gone. Obama's advisors got to him and said, you cannot look down. That's not what a president does. You have to confront, even visually, or what I would call audit your opponent. And then at the same time, defiance goes up. And what I mean by defiance are firm gestures, making a fist, being kind of resolute, things that are not open, calm, always accepting, but things that are really kind of not quite angry, but really kind of, within yourself, being confident and assertive. Okay, then I'll just show a little bit of this, and you can see what I mean by how noticeable it is when Obama looks down
to 25%. But don't forget, you put $90 billion, like 50 years worth of breaks into solar and wind, to Solyndra and Fist.
Okay, so he's looking down. He's actually starting to smirk. He's probably writing notes, but the problem is he's not visually engaging his opponent. And that made supporters and partisans really upset. And if you look, and we call it inappropriate because it violated expectations. Now, the third debate, you see a completely different Obama, and notice if he ever looks down.
To help this industry get on its feet. And the idea that has been suggested that I would liquidate the industry, of course not. Of portion.
Let's check the
That's the
record.
height of silliness.
Let-
I have
let's
never
check-
said I
let's
would
check the record.
I would liquidate the industry.
Governor,
I want to keep
people
the
in
industry
Detroit,
growing
don't
and
forget.
thriving.
So in addition to not looking down, he's also not waiting his turn. And as Dhavan's going to talk about in terms of Twitter reaction and response, this ends up being pretty important. So, it's a real-time debate. These days, you've got a split screen. Viewers are looking at both candidates at the same time for the most part. I know there are some formats where you can have one candidate at a time, but I would say most people are looking at the split screen. And if you wait your turn, you lose the opportunity and you allow the other person to score points continuously, even if it's not their turn. So you have to really play that carefully if you're a candidate. Now, just quickly, we did some eye tracking studies of appropriate and inappropriate displays. And what we found is very consistent with the theory. Sorry, this is so jumpy. That appropriate displays are rated higher. In other words, they receive a more positive evaluation regardless of the candidate. And the inappropriate displays are rated lower. This was significant in t-tests. And then here's the one that really is interesting, is that inappropriate displays are focused on longer. This is gaze fixation in terms of number of seconds. And so regardless of your partisan affiliation, Democrat, Republican, Independent, you're looking at inappropriate displays longer than appropriate. If the candidate's doing the right thing, no reason to look at it. Everything's cool. Just move on. If they're doing something off, you study it more. The fact you're looking at it more and devoting more cognitive resources to it means you'll probably be more critical as a result of it. Candidates get penalized for the most part for doing inappropriate things unless it's your signature kind of performance like it was Trump's. Trump was the exception. In the end, the attention made more difference than the evaluation. So we engage then in old debate about debates, which is how much do these visual factors and candidate appearances matter? Are they more important than what candidates say or how they sound? Do audiences attend more to candidate visuals and behavior than political arguments? So these questions have been raised ever since the 1960 debates with Kennedy-Nixon. Nixon was so convinced that through the election forum that, not only did he never look at the debates again, but there weren't presidential debates for another 16 years. There's been research on this recent and going back to the contemporary era, but Druckmann finds that among subjects with no knowledge of the 1960 debate, watching versus listening did affect evaluations, and there was increased reliance on personality perceptions if you viewed it. I did a very detailed analysis of the first debate, 1960 debate myself, and found that Nixon, in fact, exhibited more aggression, more inappropriate displays, looking down, looking away, not engaging the opponent, and showed more signs of stress, whether that was signs of sweat or having to kind of cover his face or even blinking than Kennedy did. So was that real? Was there a difference in the way the candidates appeared? There was a big difference. And from Druckmann's research and others, there was an effect there. Now, production choices in the way that debates and other kind of political events now are presented are having an effect. And Diana Mutz has found that, the perception of incivility rises in TV talk shows and also in debates when you've got a direct kind of a visual confrontation, even if the people aren't in the exact same space, they're in different rooms as in the top panel. And it's amplified by these production choices. And the perception of incivility starts to erode trust. So you increase interest in eyeballs, but you get a negative outcome for democracy, which is an erosion of trust. And this has also been extended to debates by some of Dhavan's work with his students. And it heightens the perception of conflict to have the split screen, and it makes all the gestures, all the size, all the body language much more evident. So Obama might have assumed he's off camera. No, he was on camera and people were noticing. So then we get to the social media era and we wonder, okay, how does all this first screen behavior and viewing now affect responses on the second screen? So we've got an incredible opportunity to now look at people's real-time responses in a mass level, but in a micro fashion, because they're being kind of written and broadcast and sent out over social media on a second by second basis. So we get the same questions, only now we can test some of these things along with our biobehavioral theories in direct response to debates in real time by using social media data. So this gets us to our Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, and I'm going to turn it over to Dhavan here, and he can explain why we have this reference. Sound.
Go ahead and click on the ad, and I'll let people watch the ad. For those who may not be familiar with this campaign from the 1970s, it was a classic for Erik and I growing up. So go ahead and click on it.
Peanut butter.
Chocolate.
Got peanut butter on my chocolate. Well, you got chocolate in my peanut butter. Bravissimo.
Two great tastes that taste great together. Reese's Peanut Butter Cup. Real milk chocolate. Good old-fashioned peanut butter.
Reese's Peanut Butter Cup.
So for those of you who spent any time growing up in American culture, you may remember that, or at least you have to probably be, 50 years old like Erik and I. For those of the younger among you, it was an ad that was about the happenstance combination of two things, chocolate and peanut butter, resulting in something fantastic and new. Well, I had gone down to Texas Tech during my sabbatical for a talk. And while I was down there, Erik and I had gone to breakfast, and we were talking about data he had on this microcoding of debates and looking at these image bites of how candidates were behaving. And I had been looking at debate data and looking at how people clustered and spoke during debates. And it occurred to us that we could combine these two data sets, that we could literally sync up what was happening on the screen with what was happening through the second screen. And it really, resulted in a series of papers that kind of grew out of this. And again, all of these are available if people want to see them. These were in the US context, and then also we extended it to the European context for the French debates. And then we also looked at South Korea and some subsequent work. But let's just go forward, Erik, and I'll get into some of what we found in this work. The ability to take social media and use it as a form of data is something that at the time we were doing this was kind of new. It was kind of novel. At this point, it's something that's done with great regularity, but we want to talk about different ways we might use social media data and the ways we can access it as we get more into the both workshop and then the co-op idea. So really what we're talking about here is the ability, as Erik said, real-time tracking of audience behavior, particularly during moments of national focus and conversation. During presidential debates, there is more mentions of the candidates during presidential debates sometimes than there are during election night. Just to give a census of the volume of discourse that's taking place during a debate. They are the Super Bowl of politics. There is nothing equivalent to it in terms of the amount of eyeballs on screens when you talk about the different networks, people streaming it and watching it. There is no other equivalent in terms of a high intensity event. And what's interesting here is that this moves the outcome variable, and Erik's been talking about just a spate of this wonderful basic research that's been done around the question of image bite politics and these biobehavioral questions. Suddenly now we can look at these questions on a mass scale outside of the lab, right? We can say, how do people behave in real time? What are they responding to? Can you go ahead, Erik?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that we're trying to do is, identify key variables that show the most promise in predicting viewer response. What is it that appears to drive both? Initially, we were interested in both the volume, who's getting the mentions, because clearly one of the things that we know from the online world is it's a game of dominance, attention dominance, attention amplification, and just kind of share of voice. But we were also interested in sentiment. Were you getting both positive or negative kinds of utterances or words associated with your name? So again, using different kinds of instruments, both on the visual side to whittle down what we wanted to use as inputs, but then also what we're looking at as outputs. The other challenge here was syncing this up with Twitter data and then ultimately determining the right lag. So essentially you have two different data sets, and I'll come back to this at the end when we talk about the co-op idea. Twitter is tuned to Greenwich Mean Time. If we could sync up data officially to Greenwich Mean Time, and we knew what Greenwich Mean Time was when a debate started or what exactly that moment was, we'd have better luck. We had to use various techniques to sync that up, which were inherently challenging for each individual debate. And then ultimately determining the right lag. And that lag question will come back in terms of looking at how quickly effects emerge, right? So these are very, very rapid effects. We're using time series models to test them. Sometimes time series and models are used to test does that effect happen in subsequent days, 3 days later, 5 days later. We're looking at 10-second gaps oftentimes. Did it happen in this 10 seconds, the next 10 seconds, or 20 seconds later? So ultimately what we did back in 2012, for the 2012 data, when we realized we had these two different data sets, was combine Erik's coding of these 90-minute debate segments in 30-second segments. And then we had rhetorical elements that we coded. And then we also coded for tone of voice, various kinds of emotional displays, happiness and reassurance, or anger and threat, gesture valence, whether it was affinity or defiance gestures, as Erik has covered, and then including things like blink rate, the mean, and the standard deviation of their blink rate. We combine this with a data source that we've been collecting at Wisconsin, which was and is a garden hose sample of tweets, 10% of global Twitter. It was about 400 million tweets a day. So we got about 10% of that. We were capturing about 40 million tweets a day. That archive now has, I think, over 70 billion tweets. And then we've now made it a more dedicated archive for COVID endpoint. And then we have other kinds of access points for this same kind of garden hose content. This was assessed through Twitter Streaming API, and we'll talk a little bit about the academic endpoint later in the presentation. We house all this in a Hadoop Hive warehousing system in the computer systems lab here at the UW. And then we're able to query that large data set for specific features. So in this case, we requested every tweet that mentioned Trump, mentioned Romney or mentioned Obama. That's what we pulled from this content. Go ahead, Erik. Once we synced this up, we could then run time series models to look and examine the relationship between the rhetorical features or the kinds of things that they were saying. Are they saying some kind of punchy retort? Those were the memes. Tonal elements, like their tone of voice, was they're using an angry tone, were they using a reassuring tone? And then we could look at the visual elements. And what we found was the rhetorical features somewhat mattered a little bit for, in 4 of 8 tests and 2 of 8 tests for volume and sentiment. But it was really the mimetic elements, highly memorable utterances, or kind of unintentionally humorous ones. Then we also found tonal elements, but there it was, again, only out of 16 tests, 4 of the tests came back, and again, mainly for volume. And those were, again, expressions of anger and frustration generating volume. What we found, I think, that's most interesting is in almost half the tests, visual elements were the thing that tended to drive the Twitter response. Mainly anger and threatening expressions, as well as blink rate, that kind of expression of evasion or nervousness. And I think, again, this goes to the point that Erik was making earlier about how important these visual displays are for how the public processes these high intensity moments. Can you go forward, Erik? And so again, support for the underlying theory here. Candidates' nonverbal communication shape the volume and valence of expression on Twitter beyond the verbal and the tonal, and especially the visual do. And the Twitter users respond minimally to the rhetorical characteristics. It was memes and really these kinds of big intensity moments. And we've recently published a piece on kind of resonant moments and memes, but it's something that I think, again, demands deeper attention. The tone mattered, but again, mainly negative tone. But what people really responded to on Twitter was the visuals, expressions, gestures, postures, blink rate, especially when it was angry and threatening. And it was, again, both the rate of blinking and sudden variations in rate. So suddenly, if you look like you were changing up and you look nervous in response to something, that seemed to be more of a signal. Go ahead, Erik. So our next goal then was extending this work into the 2016 campaign. The 2016 campaign posed a couple of unique challenges. One is we had a gender dynamic within the election itself that created certain challenges, I think, for Hillary Clinton as a candidate who, if she were to behave as aggressively as Donald Trump, would have been coded and treated differently potentially. And I think her handlers probably suggested that to her. On the other hand, you had a completely, as Erik has already hinted, a candidate that does not behave in the ways that candidates conventionally behave. And frankly, is very performative in his politics and is very aware of the camera and how to treat the camera if you want to draw and get and maintain attention. And I would argue Trump is just brilliant at generating publicity, period, right? That is his entire game. He's running more of a distraction engine than anything else, but it's a fantastically powerful set of techniques. So to do this, we wanted to do two things. One, code at a more narrow unit level because things were happening quite quickly, and then expand the coding beyond rhetorical features to interruptions, verbal non-fluencies, the moderator role, and then to think about this also within whether we needed to deal with this gender dynamic within the debate. Lurking behind all of this was globally the rise of populism. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Erik, who's going to talk us through that.
Right. So just kind of quickly to get through this trend so we can get to more of the computational type of work. You think of ways you can extend the nonverbal paradigm. And up until now, there's been a lot of work on single debates and on isolated incidents, really encounters. There might be a particularly volatile congressional hearing or Supreme Court nomination. Even those are rare, and most of the times they're just analyzed rhetorically, which is fine, but what about the nonverbal? So with this project, we're starting to look at trends, and we want to look at international leaders and compare them to each other. We want to look at trends within US politics to see if a populist or at least an aggressive style has been building, and if so, when did it become noticeable? So this kind of dovetails with the international trend of populism in general. And oops, you can see the difference just between 1998 and 2018. Now, some people say, well, populism is kind of waxing right now or is kind of leveling off, but it's waning. It's still out there and it's still in effect. Here's a rhetorical analysis, and this was done by academics, but it was sponsored by the Guardian newspaper in the UK. And it's really interesting just to array politicians on a scale of populist language and rhetoric. And so Hugo Chavez died in 2006, was at the highest level of the scale. And he got Angela Merkel, who's just exiting German politics now, was at the lowest end. And Trump was somewhere in the middle, almost on the lower end, just slightly below the middle there. And so that's interesting. So language itself may not get at what's essential about populism. But look at Bolsonaro, for instance, widely called and labeled a populist down in Brazil. And he's even lower than Trump. So what we're wondering is, do behaviors help to distinguish what the populist style is? And so we actually applied this to the 2016 debates, and we're also going to apply it to 2020 when we're in the middle of that now. Now, I'd just like to include some historical slides just to show images, just to show that populism and the style, the forceful kind of animated physical style is not, something brand new, and it didn't start with Trump. It's been around for a long time, American politics, and probably before there was photography. But Teddy Roosevelt was a great example. The turn of the century in the early 1900s, Huey Long out of Louisiana in the 1930s kind of scared a lot of people, both for his rhetoric, but also the way he seemed so determined. Of course, in the 1930s, you also had Hitler. In the 1960s, you've got George Wallace and his segregationist stances really being reinforced by a forceful nonverbal style. And you can apply populism more generally, as we did in Image Bite Politics, just to a couple different dimensions. One is mass appeal, which you can see here. And another one is kind of a sense of ordinariness. It just kind of one of the guys, one of the people, nothing fancy here. And that's a type of populist appeal too, and it's visual. So the important thing is that there's ways to look at populism that are visual. So how do we do it in debates? Well, we look at most of the aggressive variables that we have already: anger, threat, defiance, disagreement, which can be both verbal and nonverbal. If somebody's wagging their finger, if they're kind of dismissing somebody, and here you have Clinton and Trump both trying to dismiss each other with their hands, just wave the other person off. You're wrong, just forget what you're saying. And she's saying you just need to get off the stage. You've got hostile interruptions, interjections, hostile takeovers of conversations or a floor time, and inappropriate displays. Now, in a populist sense, this probably all plays very well to the audience. We're out of the dimension of the narrow band of polite politics. And you get your turn, but boy, you don't have to be happy about it up here. And so there might be other indicators as well. And we included some non-fluencies, which are broken phrases, common language, repeated words, sometimes non sequiturs. It doesn't matter. What matters is the assertiveness with which you're trying to engage the opponent. It can also include character attacks, a threatening tone, and then angry language, for which we used the Luke kind of off-the-shelf coding system, as well as diction, which is another off-the-shelf coding system for blame. And you can also look for lack of sophistication, although interestingly, we found that didn't really drive much in terms of Twitter. So we get to Trump's performative style, and it really is unique, and it's really out there. And some of his expressions and nonverbal kind of gestures didn't even make sense, except to communicate dominance. You don't belong in the stage. Just listen to me. That might even be a white power symbol. Up yours. I've got the answer. It's a very resonant style. So we compared Trump and Clinton on a similar set of variables. Now, it's not that we would expect Clinton to really engage in a lot of this, but by looking at the same variables, we can at least do a comparison. Gender dynamics are obviously at play, but let's just see what the data say. Does Trump use more anger threat? Does he use more defiance? Well, massively so. Does he use more of an angry tone? Is Clinton, by and large, more subdued in all her expressive behaviors? Absolutely. Oops, sorry. Does this happen in debate 3? Well, debate 3, Clinton gets a little more expressive, but so does Trump. And Trump he puts the pedal to the metal and he just keeps the accelerator on the whole time. He only knows kind of one way to debate. And that was even more evident in 2020, which people thought he was a little bit unhinged, but it was very forceful and probably, it was the height of aggression we've seen in American presidential debates, that's for sure. Okay, now we thought, well, let's try to level the playing field and compare Trump, not to female candidate, but to two previous male candidates and see if he still outperforms them in terms of aggression. Is he really that off the hook with his behaviors? So what we did was we normed our coding to the 2012 election, where we had 30-second increments. So these are data all within 30-second intervals, as we say down here. And does Trump outperform or out-express Obama and Romney in pretty much every single variable? Yes, except happiness, reassurance, and affinity. So on all the aggressive variables, on all the things we would associate with populism, Trump really does seem be out aggressing, out menacing everybody else. And he does this not only in the first debate, but in the third debate as well. So more of an apples to apples comparison there, but it really seems to hold up. Here, it's interesting. Once you have this data, you can compare candidates to themselves. So here's Clinton versus Clinton from debate 1 to debate 3. You can see the level at which she becomes more expressive just compared to her own behavior in debate 1. And then we've got Trump in debate 1 versus debate 3. And he's pretty consistent, although there might be some variation on character attacks went down a little bit. His non-fluencies went down a little bit, but his tone also went down. But still, he was much higher than Clinton overall. And so there's a series of papers that we've done out of this. Most recently, not most recently, but really summarizing the populist take on this is a paper in New Media and Society called Performing Populism. So the next step in this is to look at candidates and leaders and politicians internationally. So now we're going to kick it back to Dhavan, start talking a little more about the computational side of things.
So Erik already kind of hinted at the question we're trying to examine here in that microcoding of all these different features of, we had happiness, reassurance, fear, evasion, all those same things coded. But in this case, we created an index specifically to code that populist style, right? And it was a combination of different elements. It was a combination of how a candidate appeared. It was along with how they said things, as well as what they said. So that blame and denigrating language combined with using hostile tone, combined with defiance gestures, or some of those fear and anger. And again, as Erik has been saying very consistently, this is about dominance displays. This is about showing you're in charge. And sadly, what I think the 2012 data showed us is people pay attention to that. We would love to think they're paying attention to the arguments, but what we tune into and what we attend to and respond to tends to be these kinds of visual displays. And in particular, the question here is, how much are they paying attention to these kinds of dominance displays and this kind of transgressive style that Trump in particular embodies? So the shift in research style here was, now we're actually, rather than having our own archive, we were able to go to a commercial provider, this case GNIP, and actually purchase all of the content, not a 10% sample, but instead 100% of the content. GNIP is essentially owned by Twitter, and Twitter may be willing to make this debate data available, and that's part of what we want to propose in the co-op. That was approximately 5 million tweets in debate 1 and 3 million tweets in debate 3. Again, we wanted the tweets that only mentioned Trump or Clinton, and then we did a measure of discourse dominance. How much were they controlling the discourse? Go ahead, Erik. So again, when we look at kind of volume of mentions here over time during the debate, you can see how kind of attention rises, and then there's kind of peak moments throughout the debate, and how to some degree there's a hydraulic effect. When one candidate is speaking, they're more likely to get attention than not. And so there's a bit of movement back and forth, but there's also high intensity moments where both candidates are generating a lot of attention. And so part of what, one of those 3 sites that Erik showed in that previous slide is a site that we produced a piece that really talks about advanced time series modeling techniques to do this kind of estimation. How do we actually look carefully at these kinds of dynamic processes, oftentimes when they're interrelated, right? So when there's actually a kind of hydraulic effect in relationship between 2 variables where the rise of one may suppress attention to the other. Can you go forward, Erik? So accounting for all of that, the question that we were trying to ask and that we answered in that piece in New Media and Society was really whether or not that really aggressive style, and particularly driven by visuals, but also, as I said, having tonal and verbal elements was really driving this a response on Twitter. And we broke that index down into visual elements, tonal elements, and verbal elements of this kind of indicators of populism. And what we found was, in fact, Trump's visual populist style drove the Twitter response and did almost immediately. T equals immediate, T minus 1 is 10 seconds later, T minus 2 is 20 seconds later. So this is an almost immediate response that's sustained over time for almost 60 seconds. When Trump does these kinds of moves, it drives a Twitter response. Can you go forward, Erik? On the other hand, when we look at Clinton, this is not the case. You'll notice when we were looking at Trump, we controlled for Clinton. When we're looking for Clinton, we're controlling for Trump mentions. So this is a more dynamic model. But again, the visual elements, if they matter for Clinton, they matter much later, 50, 60 seconds in. What is driving the Twitter response for Hillary Clinton? It is her verbal style. But it's taking a lot longer to percolate, almost 30 to 40 seconds before she's really making a mark on Twitter. And again, these dynamics are happening very fast. Can you go forward? And so some takeaways from this it's okay. Some takeaways from this are, again, a populist visual and verbal style drove the Twitter response. Twitter is, really highly reactive to Trump's visually aggressive style in particular, and they respond really quickly. They're less responsive to Clinton's verbal efforts at kind of populist assertions. Those kinds of arguments, rhetorical tactics takes longer to draw a response, and they resonated less seemingly. And in the face of these populist attacks, verbal parries may be less effective. And even if the public says they prefer a kinder, gentler politics, when it comes to debates, and when it comes to Twitter, it seems that this kind of more aggressive response generally is important for shaping who has information dominance and who has verbal dominance in the Twitter space. So, what we're thinking of here is almost the second screen becomes kind of a spin room, where if you're not able to control the discourse quickly, you're at a disadvantage. And that 30-second difference between how quickly Trump's supporters respond and are able to kind of draw discourse dominance versus the opposite, I think is really telling. Keep going, Erik. Mm-hmm. So really now I want to move in, probably about 10 minutes, 15 minutes. We'll try to cover the kind of computational aspects of this in relation to the co-op we're suggesting. The framework of research that Erik and I have embarked on, we've created a lot of shared data sets. We have data of microcoding of debates, sometimes at the 30-second level, sometimes at the 10-second level, some of these going back to 1976. We also have coding, not just those visual elements, but tonal characteristics and some textual characteristics as well. In addition to that, for 2012, 2016, and 2020, we have social media data. And the ability to combine it in the way we have is really intriguing. But the other really interesting aspect is using computer vision tools potentially to start to leverage all of this trained data, all this data we have hand-coded by humans, saying this is a frown, this is a positive expression, this is a negative expression. These are training data that can be used to train computer vision detection systems, machine learning algorithms that can look at faces and facial telemetry and use that to make judgments about emotion. So can you go forward, Erik? So the other advantage is, as we move forward with this work, we have good relationships with Twitter. We have access to their academic endpoint 2.0. We've been in communication with people like Nick Pickles, who is their director of public policy, and might be a good person for C-SPAN to get in touch with to see if they'd be willing to house at least debate-related data for that period of time the debate is running on the C-SPAN website that would correspond to a particular debate. But what's interesting is we now have the ability to track moment by moment. When we say moment by moment, we really mean down to the second expression and behavior across a range of platforms. So we have tools like Synthesia, which is, I mentioned first we were doing our own scraping and we still maintain an archive. Then we were using a commercial provider where we purchased data like GNIP. Now we have a subscription to Synthesio Infigi, Atlas. These are tools that we can go in and we can pull down a certain amount of content within our terms of service on particular topics through dashboards. And these are really powerful tools that I would encourage people who want to move into computational social science to become familiar with. They certainly make data access a lot more feasible, and they essentially consolidate APIs through these kinds of commercial providers. They aren't cheap, but again, I think they're quite worth it. And hopefully in some cases, like with Twitter, they're willing to cooperate with academic researchers. You can also do things like Twitter's academic track, which is again, free of charge, and they give academic track access. We're actually doing a workshop later this week at Wisconsin to show people how to get, and make use of that academic track. And then you can also just use R and Python as scrapers just to scrape the back end of a lot of these different kinds of tools. So when we talk about the social media response, the viewer response via social media, we have a range of platforms we can look across. We can look at Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, but also YouTube, Reddit. So our ability now is expanded beyond these initial ones. But really the meat and potatoes of what we want to talk about in terms of the co-op is next. So if you want to go forward, Erik. And one of the things we want to do again is finer grained analysis, but ultimately automate coding, especially of political nonverbals based on moment by moment analysis, right? And develop more nuanced machine learning techniques to parse tweet features. So there's two fronts on which a co-op where data would be made available could draw a lot of attention from both computer scientists, political scientists, and communication scientists interested in doing work around either computer vision or natural language processing. And again, the idea of having a shared data set, computer science loves that because they can use it for benchmarking. They can show how a new algorithm, a new technique improves upon, say, a detection or a standard that someone else has produced. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. Can you go forward, Erik? So there's a number of pieces that have started to move forward with this computational approach. There's the piece that Erik did with Junsuk Ju at UCLA. And there's another piece that they're in the process, I think, of pushing forward on. Actually, it may have come out now in Notes in Computer Science. There's also a student of mine, Zongkai Sun, who's been doing multimodal human language analysis and machine learning, and then broader multimodal analysis. So we'll talk about these two as kinds of frameworks that could be used for future both computer vision work, text-based work, or ideally multimodal work. Go ahead, Erik. So at the most basic level, if we can have computers do the same kind of detection of a person's expressions, their facial movements, their blink rate, those are all things that we can train computers to sense and detect. Now, how do we do that? We do that by having large pools of available coded human validated data, which we have. That's what Erik and I have been doing for the last, Erik's been doing it for longer than I have when it comes to his image byte analysis, but especially the debate register, we've got 2012, 2016, and 2020 data. Go ahead, Erik. And machine classification of images can work really well for certain characteristics, and so here they're looking at how well, Trump can be predicted relative to Clinton, relative to the kind of baseline. And you can see that red line outperforming, higher predicted accuracies for Trump. Trump is easier sometimes to classify, partly because his gestures and expressions are so dynamic and so performative. Can you go forward, Erik? But really, I think the essence of what we'd like to push the field towards, what we think a data co-op would have tremendous value, is in two fronts. One is multimodal language analysis, where we can use data and algorithms to kind of generate and address a task, whether we're trying to code for sentiment expression or emotion. When you can have a common data set, whether that's tweets about the candidates mentioned during the debate, or whether that is the actual text of the debate itself, those can be the kinds of things that multimodal language analysis that can rely on a multitude of features, sometimes beyond just what's being said, but how it's being said, or the facial expression that accompanies a word. Suddenly now you have, as we did with our notion of the populism index, we were looking at visual features, we were looking at tonal features, and we were looking at textual features. All three of them together have to be considered when we think about this. Can you move to the next click over? And so really what we're talking about is taking audio sequence information, video sequence information, and text vectors and putting them into a multimodal vector to create a classification. If I want to know what someone's emotion is, I have to train first on an audio sequence. When human beings thought there was angry tone, is there something that an audio detector can pick up and then marry and match against that? What about with a video sequence? Can we pick up when human beings have coded literally thousands of elements that say, okay, in these instances, someone's angry, under these instances, someone's happy? Can a video sequence detect and classify that? And can we do that with a text vector? And then can we combine those three in a multimodal analysis where we're using audio, video, and text together to do our classification? Can you click forward? But really what we're talking about is even more complex than that, because really what we're talking about here is using what's called deep canonical correlation analysis, or in this case, interactional canonical correlation analysis. And what you have here is the idea that you're going to get your best ability to understand what a text means by having visual and text combined through one classifier, audio and text combined to another classifier, and then the video and text classification and the audio and text classification trying to reconcile and essentially producing two separate solutions that then are used to do your best odds probability about what we think a classification is. So we're using, can you click forward, Erik? So canonical correlation analysis builds on deep canonical correlation analysis when it comes to this kind of multimodal analysis. What it's designed to do is maximize the correlation between the text-based audio and the text-based video. So we're putting both together. So can you click to the next slide, Erik? So imagine a situation like this. You have someone's facial expressions and they're telling you that they're bored. Oh, I just finished watching this new movie, bored, and that's how they say it. Now, I'm going to have an exaggerated facial expression, and there's going to be visual cues that accompany, as Erik was saying, bored. I might roll my eyes. I might draw out my mouth extra long. If I'm getting the tonal element, I'm going to have a lowered voice. If I'm looking at the visual element, I'm going to have certain markers. Both can be combined with the word bored to get at the designation of that being a negative classification. Can you go forward? That's the same thing we can do with candidate signal during debates. We have text, we have tone, we have visual. We have the transcript, we have the audio signal, and we have the facial expression. And all of these potentially can be automated. Go forward. Textual features, in the case of the work that Zhongkai was doing and that we're moving towards publishing, is we used a BERT classifier. And this is a kind of standard machine learning classifier, kind of out of the box. And again, you have to build these, you have to train them. So we had existing trained content that said, this is, a blame language. This is such and such language. Can you find and detect that same kind of language? For acoustic features, we used Torch Audio 2. Again, out of the box, open source. And this is, again, for acoustic features. Those were then, again, at 10-second segments, which we could then pair with and test against the training set of all the coded audio data that we had. And we could do the same thing with facial features. There we used a system called OpenFace. And again, I shouldn't say we, it was Zhongkai and Bill Satharis, his advisor, who's someone who does signal processing, is an electrical and computer engineering, and someone who I'm on a number of grants with. OpenFace, again, is a open source system for extracting facial action units. Again, done at 10-second increments. These were, again, used with the coded data we had from prior elections. Can you click forward, Erik? So specifically, what Zhongkai did in his dissertation and what we're moving towards publishing is Erik had his team go back and code from the 1980 election forward at least a 10% sample of 10-second units within the debates. And those 10-second units were coded for a variety of features, right? So there were sampled segments. For the Trump-Hillary Clinton debate, we had everything. We had all 10-second segments from both debates. But for the other debates, we did just that smaller sample of content so we could have a larger variety across time. Well, here's what's fascinating. With the one exception of the Walter Mondale Ronald Reagan debate that got a little contentious, most debates have not been very aggressive, right? Except, excuse me, you go back one slide.
Sorry.
Except when we get to these last two with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, or with Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Extremely, extremely aggressive on that aggressiveness coding scale. Go ahead, Erik. So the question was, an increase in incivility in recent political debates is gradual and evidenced by a consistent rising pattern, or did it transform into impolite political era that occurred with the rise of Trump? And I think our implicit answer, just looking at that chart, would be Trump changed the game, right? But let's go forward, and we have more strong evidence of this, which is when we tried to build the initial classifier, it would not function properly unless we separate it into two base models, one for prior to 2016 and one for after 2016. Only then could we get a model to converge and get good accuracy prediction. Can you go forward? Now, what we're able to do then is actually use all data or data prior to 2016 or 2016 and 2020 data to try to do how precisely can we code for aggressiveness, and then an F1 score, which tells us, again, how well we're performing. What's really interesting to note here is that, again, when we combine all three elements in a multimodal approach, that's when we do the best overall in terms of our overall prediction. That's the multimodal approach. And this is a proof of concept to show that kind of approach is possible. Go ahead, Erik. So our goal in creating this C-SPAN data co-op then would be to take two things. On the one hand, you have C-SPAN videos, and we've already coded it for various layers, manually coded it. We'd be willing to put that coding up, say, a year or two after we finished our coding of a particular presidential debate. So we'd be willing to put up our 2012 and 2016 coding, and pretty soon put up our 2020 coding as well, right? And that would be for all of the features that we've already coded. But that would be accompanying the actual videos that they pertain to, and they'd be time-stamped. All of this manual training data can be used by different teams of researchers who either want to validate what we've done, want to cross-check it, do deeper visual analysis like Erik has done, or who want to use it for doing mapping against social media like Erik and I have done in some of our joint research. Can you flip forward, Erik? So really what we're asking potentially here in this is C-SPAN data co-op idea would be to make videos for all presidential debates from 1976, including VP debates, available on a single dedicated page. Greenwich Mean Time timestamp so that all coding done is on a standard system. And we want to have a capability to upload manual coding of debate features for more open science. We would do that with ours, but if other teams of researchers were to have coding of those debates or rhetorical features or arguments or issues or blame language or anything else, or visual characteristics or tonal characteristics, those could also be uploaded to create a broader master data set. Then ultimately, if you had computer scientists who, like Zhong Kai, are always looking for these kinds of data sets where they can build and improve computer vision classifiers, multimodal classifiers, they would be able to do training and benchmarking. So what Zhong Kai did, and I didn't show this part of his dissertation, was he was showing that his interrelational canonical correlational analysis performed better than deep canonical correlational analysis. How much better? About 2 to 3% better. Well, in computer science, that's a big deal. Zongkai is now working for Amazon. The last student who we had working on these projects with us, who was on some of our papers, Pratyusha, is working for Apple. Junsuk Ju, who is on these papers with Erik, and is, we're working on some projects together. He was at Facebook. I mean, this is where this kind of, if you want to work in that computer science field, benchmarking and having these kinds of training sets is where it's at. And it's how you show that your tools outperform the last set of tools. The other half of this could be an archive for housing Twitter and other social media content pertaining to debates with syntax. So we could put up, if we could make the full Twitter content available, that would be ideal with metadata, but that would have to be something agreed to by Twitter. And I'd be happy to broker a conversation with Nick Pickles and other people at Twitter to try to say, hey, for this particular content space, would you be willing to make for 2012, for 2016 and 2020, any tweets mentioning, hashtag debate 2012, debate 2020, debate 2016, or the candidate names available? And I think they would. That would be my sense. Or link to a page at Twitter where they make those available, right? Now, if not, we can certainly make tweet IDs available. What are tweet IDs? Each tweet has a specific ID. I can't list the full content of what someone has posted on Twitter. That's not within the terms of service, but I can post the tweet ID, and then you can go and pull that same tweet ID. So that lets, again, for open science, you can verify my research. And so it could also, a co-op could also be a space for sharing machine learning classifiers for sentiment and other kinds of features and building better classifiers, right? And it could be expanded to archive multiple social media platforms. This could be used for, Facebook public-facing pages and Instagram public-facing pages, which Facebook and Instagram already make available through CrowdTangle, which is another tool we have. Would they be willing to share and house that content, the stuff that came off of their site during this period? And this could also be around, again, addressing things like misinformation and broader concerns about the quality of democratic information circulating during campaigns. So last slide, I think, Erik. There's you go back to the other slide if you don't mind, Erik. I mean, I think we reference some of these pieces within, but there's a much longer literature here. And again, for those of you who are interested, Erik has done a lot of this work and referenced it. Please contact him if you want, some of this research, and then other pieces that we have, certainly we can make available to you. So, we're happy to do that. And then if we want to close it up here, next slide, Erik. Again, I think we can open it up for questions at this point. The framework that we didn't want to get super technical about the co-op aspects, but more open it up for what would be possible. But Robert, I don't know if you have any guidance for us about how to approach the co-op idea, or if you just want to open it up for Q&A at this point.
Let's just open for Q&A, and I'll see if there's questions about the co-op, and we can follow up on those as well.
I'll let Erik run the Q&A. If people have questions, they can either just raise their hands, or it's I think 20 people, so we can just open it up for conversation.
Analyzing the non-verbal visual facial displays, how much do these visual factors actually matter in the presidential debates and the information you garner from that?
So we haven't used the computer vision techniques to predict, say, the social media response yet. What we've used right now is tried to build the classifier that can actually detect what's happening. But what we know from the previous studies is, yeah, the facial expressions matter a lot. They mattered in 2012, they mattered in 2016, and if we believe the evidence, they've mattered as far back as the Nixon Kennedy debates, right? So I think we ignore political visuals at our peril, and I think that's been a big theme in Erik's research, so I'll throw it open to Erik.
Yeah, I mean, there's converging evidence, and it's, this analysis we've been talking about here looks at the effect in terms of Twitter response and what they're responding to. And it's interesting because if you think about who's on Twitter, it's more or less known as kind of a spot for journalists and academics and other kind of policy thinkers. And it's interesting to me, we haven't parsed it at this level yet, that even the kind of sophisticated audience is still influenced by how it's performed. You know, not exclusively to what's said, but by and large, more to how it's said.
Yeah, that's a great point, Eric. We did an analysis. We were looking at also what role did elites play? Were elites the ones who were noticing what was happening and then passing it on to the public? And the answer was no. I mean, a lot of what was happening to the public, as Erik said, was interpreting those pieces of political information, but the elites were paying attention to them too and amplifying, right? So it was something that was only amplified through elites, but it was something that was a direct conduit to the public as well. So it's kind of fascinating to see that process unfold.
Okay, Robert?
Yes, you had that one slide where you showed the 10-second reaction. And then the Hillary Clinton reaction was much slower. How long, what's the long-term effect? I mean, 10 seconds is short, but I mean, what's like within 24 hours, does it get magnified?
So we've looked at a little bit at kind of post-debate analysis to see how much the discourse during the debate shapes post-debate attention. And I mean, I think anecdotally, what I would say is the spin room is no longer in that 30 minutes after the debate with, you know, the handlers in there talking to the press. It's happening in real time on social media. So if you can shape a person's understanding of a foible or an event in real time, that has effects. So what we've looked at in this most recent piece, Joe Lucido at Texas is the lead author on it. It's this resonant moments piece. There are examples of events where they enter the system and it's, you know, it's literally what they do is they reset the balance point. Suddenly there's just more conversation about a particular candidate. And when that happens, those effects are long lasting, right? They're not something just 10 seconds. So for example, with Trump, we saw when he did visually dominant things, it started in 10 seconds, but it lasted for 60, right? For Hillary Clinton, it started at about 40 seconds and by 60 was tapering. And so it's about how much you can control and dominate in those moments. Now, arguably, you know, is Trump getting negative attention, Hillary getting positive attention? Most of the analysis suggests no. They both were getting a lot of negative attention. That's what tends to dominate Twitter. But at the same time, the question of sentiment is important. I would argue still in this day and age, it's and what Trump would probably say too is it's about message dominance. That's why he stands behind Hillary Clinton during debates. That's why he constantly will put out information on Twitter when he's not getting attention. It's all about driving attention.
Yeah, the other thing I've done to kind of confirm effects and to get people's explanation is to run a series of focus groups. And I would show excerpts from what were these particularly resonant moments and Trump standing behind Hillary or Trump aggressing or Hillary making a sharp argument. And when people are given the opportunity to really look at something carefully, they realize what was going on in the moment. And it helps explain what their kind of inclination is or what their perception is. They can't quite put their finger on it. And when they see it, particularly if you turn the sound off, they suddenly realize what's going on and what's driving their own kind of evaluation. So I've gotten confirmation that way too, which is a little more qualitative, but I think it's important to try to triangulate and try to converge different, you know, forms of evidence so that when you start to make kind of generalizations about it, you're really speaking from a broad-based platform.
Absolutely agree with Erik there. I think one of the things that's happened across Erik's much longer program of research is the ability to see and triangulate across multiple methods, multiple instances, similar kinds of evidence, right? And that just makes you feel that much more confidence that you're barking up the right tree. You, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very informative and helpful. I just wanted to ask, one of the issues you mentioned regarded the right lag, determining the right lag to look at in Twitter. How did you decide on 10 seconds and 30 seconds respectively?
So there's two, one is the time unit we're measuring, and the other is the lag between when an event happens on the screen and when we would estimate people would start talking about it on Twitter. right? And so one way is just to try to line it up as perfectly as you can by Greenwich Mean Time. So you're just syncing everything to Greenwich Mean Time. But sometimes you don't know exactly when a particular point in time is in Greenwich Mean Time on the debate. We do have the timestamp on Twitter, right? So the question is, how do we sync it up to the debate? So the way we ultimately did it was we found kind of key events within the debate, whether there was an interruption of the moderator, when there was a new topic introduced, and suddenly we'd see a spike in discourse about that topic. We could use that to line up and go, okay, that was the first time Big Bird was mentioned. We know there's no mentions of Big Bird before then, but there's mentions of Big Bird after this. Now we can sync it up. And we did that across 4 or 5 different instances to know what the right sync point was. And then once we synced it, then we could do all our time series analysis. But again, that problem would be solved by having the debate data in Greenwich Mean Time.
Thank
Now,
you.
this is a question for both of you. What remains to be done in this research, and what do you think is the future direction of this research? Is it more debates?
Erik,
Right,
you
yeah,
ahead.
sure. So I think more comparisons, and there's a couple ways to look at this. We need to look at candidates, kind of their trajectory, their political trajectory. And this is really interesting because some become, they change their style over time. This can happen both in the US and internationally. So you have someone who kind of gets introduced to politics, and they're kind of middle of the road, and they're not very fiery. And then suddenly by the 3rd or 4th election, they're basically fire breathing and just, condemning everything. Well, what does the trajectory of that look like if we have the performative evidence? And can you start to detect when someone's really becoming aggressive, through their nonverbal behavior? So they might be polite in what they say, but they're really kind of indicating, who the enemy is, or trying to target, an opponent. And then to try to benchmark that across a larger number of candidates, not just presidential candidates, but what are the norms, for instance, within people running for Congress, people running for Senate, people running for governor? And where is the level of acceptability between kind of polite politics and more aggressive or populist politics? And if we could develop an index, kind of a benchmarking index, then we'd know whether somebody's either over or under indexing on these kind of norms of politeness. And that would provide the industry and political consultants and candidates with some real hard data on where they should be or where they want to be. And it's kind of a market research technique for talent on local TV news, but I think it equally applies to politicians. The other comparative aspect of this is we need more international work so that, we can assess what's going on in different countries, and maybe even the level of political threat there by the level of aggression that the politicians are showing. Or on the other hand, the level of politeness, the level of civility. Do we see that in, for instance, I'm just going to pick on Scandinavia. Is that really a place of polite politics? Maybe not exclusively, but you might detect it visually. So if we do more of this work, we're going to have more indicators as to where politics are, both kind of regionally, nationally, internationally, comparatively, and then even over time. So there's this, we're at the very beginning of this. And that's why we're really enamored of computer vision, because all this work takes a lot of time. And that's why we haven't seen a lot of comparative studies, because you get bogged down in the coding. And once we train the classifier, then it can just run through it.
Yeah, I'd agree with Erik. I think the comparative is a big direction. I think the comparative can also be comparative across, say, state elections or gubernatorial elections, or so comparative we're doing a lot of state level work in Wisconsin. And I think with, US politics is just defined by state level politics, and we don't pay enough attention to what's happening. There's an incivility that's penetrated our state level politics, senatorial races. We see it on the steps of the Capitol, right? And so understanding that, I think, is critically important, just because of what it's doing, the tenor and tone of our politics. And then I'd add to that I think there's 2 big fronts for future research. I think this question was kind of what's the open questions? I think on the one hand, we've looked at discourse dominance on Twitter, a little bit of salience, or sentiment, but we have not looked nearly as well at, we've looked at certain language like blame language, but we haven't just predicted that kind of language, right? So I think we really need to start looking at whether the way candidates talk online transfers to the public. Do they pick up on different themes and ideas? They pick up on the frames and their way of talking. And does that penetrate? And does that happen more when they use these really aggressive visual styles? Because they're, as Erik was saying, when they draw the attention, it's more likely to be memorable, right? So are they able to get more into your memory then? And I think that can be experimental work. I think that can be computational work. So I'm hopeful that the work we're doing could inspire work that isn't limited to the kinds of methods we're advancing or the context that we're focused on, but in fact is answering those more basic science questions.
Okay, Patty had a question?
Yes. Have you studied or seen any studies or considered studying how these same visual cues and nonverbal cues would work in a big field of primary debate candidates early in a campaign when people are largely undecided and wouldn't necessarily be judging their own candidate versus the enemy?
And you don't have the partisan cues. That's a fantastic question. We haven't, but again, I think to Robert as a point of inspiration, C-SPAN has a lot of those local debates. You have that content. And again, once these computer vision detectors are created, as long as you have some kind of social media feed behind it, but even if you don't, you can just try to use it to look at Erik's question about, is there growing incivility in politics? Are we seeing that happening at lower and lower levels? So I love the idea of looking at that. I think it's a great question.
Yeah, I would,
but it would be great to see more of it.
I would just add briefly that someone else actually on this kind of workshop, Patrick Stewart, has done a lot of work on primary debates, and he's looked at not only expressions, but also placement on the stage and other production factors. And all these things do combine to affect evaluations and someone's chance of success. So I think it certainly applies in primary contests. And there's kind of a dilemma there, though, of candidates kind of over aggressing to try to get attention versus being seen as serious. And so we had a candidate here in Texas, Beto O'Rourke, try to enter the national stage. And at first, kind of his casual style was playing, and then he got ignored, and then he went aggressive, and then he just dropped out. So there's not a universal answer here. It's a lot of kind of situational factors depending on the campaign.
I'll add one other wrinkle, which is, if you recall, Donald Trump sat out a primary debate and then tweeted throughout that debate and created a whole other layer of complexity for understanding how these dynamics work, because he was out there commenting on the debate and serving like, the meta commenter on everything each candidate was saying. So these dynamics have gotten really complicated, especially in primary debates.
There's one other factor, sorry. In primary debates, a lot of times the rules are a little looser, so the audience can chime in. Is something else that Patrick Stewart looks at is observable audience response. So if there's cheering, or if there's booing, or if there's some kind of support going on, a lot of times the candidates will play to that. And for the person watching the observable response, sometimes they'll be persuaded by that in the way that we might be persuaded by likes on social media or other social kind of endorsements.
All right, we're just about out of time here. I think we're going to follow up by getting some more people together who are technical and start looking at some of the issues that you raised in terms of the co-op. And we'll get Dhavan and Erik and some people from Purdue and maybe some other people who are on the call. And we want to thank both of you for a terrific presentation and engaging. Lots of information. We want to emphasize we have the research conference coming up in about a month less, and you're going to do a presentation there, so people want to tune in. Also, there's Andrea has got her number up, and Allison is going to present on discursive analysis in the next presentation on November 1st. So it'll be a different, looking at textual analysis primarily and using different software techniques. So we thank you, everybody, for joining us, and stay in touch.